I've watched great powers maneuver for dominance across 4 decades of teaching and research, and what unfolds today in the Caribbean carries the weight of history repeating itself with a modern twist. The headlines emerging from the Western Hemisphere in recent months would have seemed impossible just a generation ago when American naval supremacy in these waters was taken for granted. Yet here we stand, witnessing Russian military aircraft delivering Panzer S-1 and Buk M2E air defense systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Venezuela, while the United States Navy scrambles to reposition assets in response. The deployment of advanced Russian weaponry to America's neighborhood represents more than a symbolic gesture. It signals a fundamental shift in the architecture of global power that challenges assumptions Americans have held since the Monroe Doctrine was articulated 2 centuries ago. When President James Monroe declared in 1823 that the Western Hemisphere would remain free from European intervention, he established a principle that shaped American strategic thinking for generations, creating what we might call America's sphere of influence, where no rival great power could establish a foothold without triggering an existential crisis in Washington. The doctrine worked not because of its moral authority, but because the United States possessed the military capacity and geographic advantage to enforce it. Yet today, that enforcement capability faces unprecedented challenges as Russia demonstrates its willingness to project power across 7,000 miles of ocean to establish military cooperation with regimes hostile to American interests. The numbers tell a sobering story about the changing balance of power in our hemisphere. Russia increased its military spending by 38% in 2024 alone, reaching an estimated $149 billion, which represents 7.1% of its entire gross domestic product, devoted to military purposes. This level of commitment exceeds even Cold War proportions when measured as a share of national wealth, and it funds not just the war in Ukraine, but also global power projection, including naval deployments, arms transfers worth billions, and the establishment of strategic partnerships designed specifically to complicate American military planning. Venezuela has received over $14 billion in Russian arms exports between 2001 and 2014, including Su-30 Mk-2 fighter aircraft, Mi-35 attack helicopters, and S-300VM air defense systems that transform the Venezuelan military from a regional force into a potential deterrent against American intervention. The relationship deepened dramatically in December 2018 when Russian strategic bombers deployed to Venezuelan territory in a show-the-flag operation that sent unmistakable signals about Moscow's intentions, and discussions about Russian access to La Orchila Island military base suggest permanent infrastructure for power projection could materialize in the coming years. From my perspective, as someone who has spent decades studying how states behave in anarchic international systems, none of this should surprise us because great powers invariably seek to maximize their relative power position, and they do so by expanding their influence into regions that matter strategically, while simultaneously denying rivals the ability to do the same near their own borders. The anarchic structure of international politics creates a self-help system where no higher authority exists to protect states from each other, which means survival depends entirely on a nation's own capabilities and strategic choices. States cannot be certain about the intentions of other states even when those intentions appear benign today, because intentions can change rapidly when leadership changes or circumstances shift, and this uncertainty compels rational actors to assume the worst and prepare accordingly. The military capabilities that states possess are inherently offensive in nature, regardless of how those capabilities are characterized publicly, meaning any weapon system capable of defense can also be used for offense, and this reality creates a security dilemma where one state's defensive preparations appear threatening to others, who then respond with their own military buildups. In such an environment, states seeking survival have powerful incentives to accumulate as much power as possible because power remains the ultimate arbiter of disputes when diplomatic solutions fail. This is not a normative claim about how the world should work, but rather an analytical observation about how it actually does work when you strip away the rhetoric and examine state behavior across centuries of recorded history. The tragedy embedded in great power competition stems from the fact that even states with fundamentally defensive intentions find themselves compelled to engage in competitive behavior that makes everyone less secure. Russia's expanding military cooperation with Venezuela must be understood within this framework rather than dismissed as irrational provocation, because from Moscow's vantage point, these moves represent legitimate responses to American and NATO actions near Russian borders that the Kremlin perceives as existential threats to its security. The expansion of NATO from 16 members in 1999 to 32 members today has pushed the alliance's boundaries to within miles of St. Petersburg and Moscow, incorporating former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact states that Russia historically viewed as essential buffer zones. Poland joined NATO in 1999, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania followed in 2004, and more recently Montenegro in 2017, North Macedonia in 2020, and Finland and Sweden in 2023 and 2024, respectively, creating a situation where Russian military planners see Western military infrastructure encircling their territory. The April 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest proved particularly provocative when the alliance announced that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join, a declaration that Russian officials immediately characterized as crossing a red line that threatened core security interests. Over the subsequent years, Western integration of Ukraine accelerated through European Union association agreements, financial support programs worth billions of dollars, and military training initiatives designed to transform Ukrainian armed forces into NATO-compatible units capable of operating alongside Western militaries. The United States alone provided over $48 billion in military aid to Ukraine in 2024. Along with advanced weapon systems including long-range missiles, main battle tanks, and F-16 fighter aircraft that fundamentally alter the military balance along Russia's western frontier. These weapons deliveries, totaling tens of billions annually, represent not just hardware transfers, but also the integration of Ukraine into Western military networks through training programs, intelligence sharing, and operational coordination that Russian planners interpret as preparation for future conflict. When Americans express outrage at Russian military presence in Venezuela, we must ask ourselves whether we would accept Chinese or Russian military bases in Mexico or Canada, whether we would remain calm if Beijing signed defense agreements with Ottawa that included deployments of advanced missile systems within striking distance of American cities, or whether Washington would tolerate a hostile military alliance expanding to our borders while assuring us the expansion posed no threat to our security. The honest answer reveals the double standard embedded in much contemporary discussion about great power competition, where actions taken by the United States and its allies are characterized as defensive and stabilizing, while identical actions by rivals are labeled aggressive and destabilizing. This is not to suggest moral equivalence between democratic and authoritarian systems, but rather to acknowledge that from a realist perspective focused on power and security, both sides behave according to similar strategic logic determined by their position in the international system. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 offers the most instructive historical parallel to our current situation because it demonstrates how great powers react when rivals establish military presence in their spheres of influence. When American intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba just 90 miles from Florida, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade and threatened military action, including possible invasion, unless the missiles were removed, bringing the world closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. The crisis resolved only when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, an arrangement that preserved each superpower's fundamental security while allowing both sides to claim victory. The key lesson from that crisis centers not on who was right or wrong in moral terms, but rather on the recognition that great powers will risk war rather than accept enemy military infrastructure near their borders, and that stable international orders require mutual acknowledgement of each side's core security interests. The United States spends $997 billion annually on military capabilities, which represents 37% of total global military expenditure and roughly 3 times what China spends, despite China's far larger population and rapidly growing economy. This enormous investment funds 11 aircraft carrier strike groups that can project power anywhere on Earth, over 800 military bases in more than 70 countries, nuclear arsenals sufficient to destroy civilization multiple times over, and conventional forces capable of defeating any rival in direct confrontation. Yet even this overwhelming military superiority cannot guarantee security in a multipolar world where other great powers possess their own formidable capabilities and willingness to challenge American dominance in their own regions. China's military spending increased by 59% over the past decade to reach $314 billion in 2024, funding a naval expansion that has produced the world's largest fleet by number of hulls, advanced stealth aircraft, hypersonic missiles, and a growing nuclear arsenal that challenges American conventional superiority in the Western Pacific. European NATO members collectively spent $454 billion on defense in 2024. An increase of 17% from the previous year, driven primarily by threat perceptions related to the Russia-Ukraine war and fears that American security guarantees may prove unreliable in future crises. These spending figures, measured in hundreds of billions annually, reflect a global return to great power competition that many analysts believed had ended with the Cold War's conclusion, and they demonstrate that the unipolar moment of American hegemony has passed into a multipolar reality where multiple great powers compete for influence and security. Military expenditure in Central America and the Caribbean more than doubled between 2015 and 2024, increasing by 111% as regional states respond to drug trafficking, organized crime, and now great power competition playing out in waters that have been dominated by American naval forces since the Spanish-American War. If you're watching this analysis unfold and finding value in understanding how great power politics shape our world, I encourage you to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel for more in-depth geopolitical analysis, activate the notification bell so you don't miss future content, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from, your city and country, because I'm genuinely curious about the global audience engaging with these ideas. Mexico increased its military spending by 39% in 2024 alone to reach $16.7 billion, driven primarily by funding for the Guardia Nacional and Navy operations against criminal organizations, but also reflecting growing awareness that the Caribbean basin has become contested space where external powers seek influence. Colombia boosted military expenditure by 14% to $15.1 billion as the government intensified operations against dissident armed groups in the country's southwest after peace negotiations collapsed, demonstrating how internal conflicts and external great power competition often intersect in complex ways. Guyana recorded the largest annual percentage increase in military spending globally, with a 78% jump to $202 million following Venezuela's unilateral claim over the disputed Essequibo region, a territorial dispute that has suddenly taken on greater significance given Venezuela's role as a platform for Russian power projection into the hemisphere. The strategic logic driving Russian engagement in Latin America becomes clearer when we examine it through the lens of what I call offensive realism, which posits that the structure of the international system compels great powers to seek regional hegemony as the optimal means of ensuring survival. States operating in an anarchic system where no world government exists to enforce rules or protect the weak must rely on their own capabilities to survive, and the most effective way to guarantee survival involves becoming so powerful in your own region that no distant great power can threaten you. The United States achieved regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere by the early 20th century, which then allowed America to prevent European and later Soviet interference in its neighborhood while projecting power globally without fear that rivals would exploit vulnerabilities close to home. Russia today seeks to rebuild its own sphere of influence in the former Soviet space, which explains its military interventions in Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, and its insistence that neighboring states cannot join NATO without Russian consent. China pursues hegemony in East Asia through military modernization, territorial claims in the South China Sea, and economic integration initiatives like the Belt and Road program that bind neighboring economies to Beijing. Each of these great powers views American military presence near their borders as threatening precisely because it prevents them from achieving the regional dominance that would ensure their security, and they respond by developing capabilities to deny American access to their periphery, while simultaneously probing for opportunities to establish their own presence in America's hemisphere. The proposed Russian access to Venezuelan military facilities represents exactly this kind of probing action, testing whether the United States retains the will and capability to enforce its traditional sphere of influence in an era of global overextension. The Pentagon faces a strategic dilemma that becomes more acute each year as American military commitments multiply, while resources remain finite despite record spending approaching $1 trillion annually. The 2022 National Defense Strategy identifies China as the pacing challenge requiring long-term focus, while also mandating credible deterrence against Russia in Europe and maintaining capabilities to address threats from Iran and North Korea. This strategy necessitates maintaining overwhelming naval superiority in the Western Pacific, sufficient ground and air forces in Europe to deter Russian aggression against NATO allies, missile defense systems capable of intercepting attacks from multiple directions, and now renewed attention to the Caribbean and Latin America, where rival powers seek to establish footholds. In October 2025, the United States deployed 10,000 troops, dozens of aircraft, and multiple naval vessels to the Caribbean in response to Russian activities in Venezuela, constructing new ammunition bunkers at facilities in Puerto Rico to support armed drone operations and establishing forward operating locations in Aruba and Curaçao. These deployments cost billions of dollars and require sustained presence to maintain deterrent effect, yet they divert resources and attention from other theaters where peer competitors continue building their own capabilities. What I want Americans to understand, and what makes this situation so tragically predictable, is that from Moscow's perspective, the entire narrative looks fundamentally different than the one we've constructed in Washington and repeated endlessly through media channels that rarely question underlying assumptions about American benevolence and Russian aggression. When I warned in 1997 alongside 50 other foreign policy experts in an open letter that NATO expansion would prove to be a profound strategic mistake, when I published analyses arguing that pushing the alliance eastward would eventually trigger the kind of great power confrontation we now witness in Ukraine, I was dismissed by establishment voices who insisted Russia had no legitimate security concerns and that sovereign nations could choose their own alliances without regard to geopolitical realities. The subsequent quarter-century has vindicated those early warnings in the most tragic way possible, with hundreds of thousands dead in Ukraine, European security architecture in ruins, and the risk of direct confrontation between nuclear-armed powers higher than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The expansion of NATO from 16 members at the Cold War's end to 32 members today proceeded despite repeated Russian objections that were characterized in Western capitals as the complaints of a declining power that needed to accept its diminished status in the post-Soviet order. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999, followed by Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia in 2004, then Albania and Croatia in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, North Macedonia in 2020, and most recently Finland and Sweden in 2023 and 2024. Each wave of expansion pushed NATO's borders closer to Russia's heartland, incorporating former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact states that Russian strategic planners had viewed for centuries as essential buffer zones protecting against invasion from the West. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania now host NATO forces within 150 miles of St. Petersburg, Russia's second-largest city and former imperial capital, while alliance infrastructure extends along the entire western frontier, from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. This encirclement looks remarkably similar to the cordon sanitaire that Western powers attempted to construct around Bolshevik Russia after World War I, and it produces the same paranoid response from Moscow that we should have anticipated if we had studied history rather than indulging fantasies about the end of geopolitics. The critical turning point arrived at the April 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest when the alliance declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join, a statement that Russian officials immediately recognized as crossing a red line that threatened core security interests. Ukraine shares an 850-mile border with Russia and has served historically as an invasion route that Napoleon and Hitler both utilized, making its alignment a matter of existential concern for any Russian government, regardless of ideology or leadership. Georgian membership would have placed NATO forces in the Caucasus region that Russia considers part of its near-abroad and essential sphere of influence. The Russian military intervention in Georgia just 4 months after the Bucharest Declaration demonstrated Moscow's willingness to use force to prevent NATO expansion, yet Western leaders interpreted this action as unprovoked aggression rather than a predictable response to alliance provocation. The pattern repeated itself in Ukraine starting in 2014 when the democratically elected but pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown in the Maidan Revolution after rejecting an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. The Western-backed government that replaced Yanukovych immediately oriented toward NATO integration, prompting Russian annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in the Donbas region. From a realist perspective, Russia's actions followed logically from its strategic position, as Moscow acted to prevent Ukraine's full incorporation into Western security structures that would have placed hostile forces directly on Russia's border and potentially closed off Russian access to the Black Sea through naval facilities at Sevastopol. The United States provided over $48 billion in military assistance to Ukraine in 2024 alone, along with weapon systems including M1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot air defense batteries, and F-16 fighter aircraft that transform Ukrainian forces into a NATO-compatible military capable of threatening Russian security. An additional $156 billion in supplemental defense funding was allocated by Congress in summer 2025 to enhance American military capabilities globally, much of it directed toward deterring Russia and China in what the Pentagon characterizes as an era of renewed great power competition. These expenditures, measured in tens and hundreds of billions, represent not just financial commitments but also strategic choices about how America allocates finite resources across multiple theaters where rivals challenge its dominance. European NATO members increased their collective defense spending to $454 billion in 2024, driven by threat perceptions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and growing uncertainty about whether the United States will maintain its security commitments to the alliance under future administrations. President Trump's repeated criticism of NATO allies for failing to meet defense spending targets, his suggestion that America might not defend members who don't pay their fair share, and his broader America First ideology that prioritizes domestic concerns over international commitments have created anxiety throughout Europe about the reliability of American security guarantees. Trump's call for NATO members to spend 5% of gross domestic product on defense rather than the current 2% target would require European states to more than double their military budgets, adding hundreds of billions in annual expenditure that most governments cannot afford without massive cuts to social programs or significant tax increases that would prove politically unpopular. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte proposed a compromise benchmark of 3.5% for traditional defense spending plus another 1.5% for security-related investments, a formulation designed to satisfy American demands while allowing European governments to count broader security expenditures toward their commitments. These debates about burden sharing within the alliance reveal deeper tensions about NATO's purpose in the post-Cold War era and whether the organization should continue expanding or consolidate around its core mission of defending existing members. The America First doctrine that Trump articulated represents a neo-isolationist approach to foreign policy that questions whether maintaining a global network of alliances and forward-deployed military forces serves American interests or merely entangles the nation in conflicts that drain resources while providing minimal security benefits. This perspective, rooted in Jacksonian populism and skepticism toward internationalist institutions, argues that the United States should prioritize border security, economic nationalism, and military strength at home rather than subsidizing the defense of wealthy allies who free-ride on American protection while running trade surpluses that undermine domestic manufacturing. The ideology shares elements with the isolationism that Patrick Buchanan championed in the 1990s and the non-interventionism that Robert Taft advocated in the 1940s, both of which questioned whether America should serve as global policeman or focus on defending the Western Hemisphere according to Monroe Doctrine principles. From this viewpoint, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe and the Baltic states committed the United States to defending territories that possess no intrinsic strategic value to American security, while unnecessarily antagonizing Russia and increasing the risk of great power war. The defense budget that now approaches $1 trillion annually cannot simultaneously maintain overwhelming superiority in the Indo-Pacific to counter China, credible deterrence in Europe against Russia, sufficient forces in the Middle East to protect oil supplies and contain Iran, and renewed focus on the Caribbean where Russian and Chinese influence expands. Military overextension historically precedes imperial decline, as Paul Kennedy documented in his study of great powers across 5 centuries, and the United States today exhibits many warning signs that strategists should recognize. The national debt exceeds $36 trillion. Interest payments on that debt consume over $1 trillion annually, and the defense budget represents approximately 3.1% of gross domestic product, despite the absence of existential threats comparable to Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union at its peak. China's economy will likely surpass America's in total size within the next decade, even as its military spending increases by double-digit percentages annually, suggesting the balance of power shifts toward Beijing regardless of how much Washington spends on defense. The fundamental question facing American policymakers concerns not whether the United States should compete with rival great powers, but rather where to compete and with what resources, given that omnipresent hegemony has become financially unsustainable and strategically counterproductive. If you've followed this analysis to this point and found the argument compelling, I would appreciate your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more geopolitical content that challenges conventional wisdom, activating the notification bell so you're alerted when new videos drop, and commenting below with your location, city, and country so I can understand where this perspective resonates globally. The mirror image that Americans refuse to acknowledge reveals that Russian actions in Venezuela replicate exactly what the United States has done along Russia's periphery, and the outrage expressed in Washington about Moscow's Caribbean presence rings hollow given NATO's expansion to Russia's borders, despite explicit promises that the alliance would not move eastward following German reunification. Declassified documents confirm that American and European leaders assured Soviet officials in 1990 that NATO would not expand beyond East Germany. Yet within a decade, the alliance incorporated Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in direct contradiction of those assurances. Russian officials who remember these broken promises view subsequent Western protestations about respecting sovereignty and international law as hypocritical, given that NATO intervened in Yugoslavia in 1999 without United Nations authorization, invaded Iraq in 2003 based on fabricated intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, and facilitated regime change in Libya in 2011 that transformed that country into a failed state. The consistency with which the United States applies principles of sovereignty and self-determination appears selective when examined historically, as Washington supports these principles when they favor American interests, but violates them when geopolitical calculations dictate otherwise. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 demonstrated that the United States would risk nuclear war rather than accept Soviet military infrastructure in Cuba, bringing the world to the brink of annihilation over missile deployments that Moscow justified as defensive measures to protect an ally against American aggression. President Kennedy imposed a naval blockade that violated international law and threatened invasion unless the missiles were removed, actions that would be characterized as aggressive and destabilizing if taken by Russia or China today. The crisis resolved through secret negotiations where the Soviet Union withdrew missiles from Cuba in exchange for American withdrawal of missiles from Turkey and a pledge not to invade Cuba, an arrangement that recognized each superpower's sphere of influence and the necessity of respecting core security concerns to avoid catastrophic war. The lesson that should have been learned from 1962 is that great powers will not accept enemy military presence near their borders regardless of legal arguments about sovereignty, and that stable international orders require mutual recognition of security interests rather than efforts to maximize advantage through encroachment on rivals' periphery. Yet American policy since the Cold War's end has systematically ignored this lesson by expanding NATO to Russia's borders while insisting that Moscow has no legitimate security concerns and should accept Western military infrastructure in Ukraine, a position that no American administration would tolerate if the situation were reversed. The 21st century international system has become multipolar whether American elites acknowledge it or not, as China's economic rise, Russia's military resurgence, and the emergence of regional powers like India, Turkey, Iran, and Brazil create a distribution of capabilities that prevents any single state from dominating globally. Secretary of State John Kerry's 2013 declaration that the Monroe Doctrine era has ended reflected recognition that Latin American states no longer accept American hegemony as legitimate. Yet the statement also revealed Washington's reluctance to define clearly what principles should govern hemispheric relations in a multipolar world. If the United States cannot prevent Chinese investment worth hundreds of billions in Latin American infrastructure, cannot stop Russian arms sales totaling tens of billions to regional governments, and cannot compel allies to follow American leadership on issues like Venezuela, where European and Latin American states maintain different policy preferences, then American power has limits that must be acknowledged in strategy formulation. The choice facing the United States involves either accepting a multipolar system where other great powers exercise influence in their regions, while America focuses on defending core interests in the Western Hemisphere, or attempting to maintain global hegemony through massive military expenditures and interventions that risk overextension and eventual decline. The former option requires abandoning the liberal internationalist project that has guided American foreign policy since World War II, accepting spheres of influence as legitimate rather than morally objectionable, and prioritizing great power stability over democracy promotion and humanitarian intervention. The latter option requires sustaining defense budgets that exceed $1 trillion annually while competing simultaneously against China in the Indo-Pacific, Russia in Europe, and emerging challenges in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. A strategy that will drain resources from domestic priorities and potentially collapse under its own weight. My assessment after studying great power politics for 40 years suggests that the former option offers greater likelihood of preserving American security and prosperity, though it requires abandoning illusions about America's ability to shape the world according to its preferences and accepting that other nations possess legitimate security interests that must be accommodated through negotiation rather than dismissed through military superiority. The tragedy of great power politics lies precisely in this reality that states must compete for security in ways that make all less secure, that actions taken for defensive purposes appear threatening to others who respond in kind, and that even rational actors seeking only survival find themselves locked in competitive spirals that increase the risk of catastrophic conflict. Russian military cooperation with Venezuela, Chinese naval presence in the South Pacific, Iranian influence in the Middle East, and Turkish intervention in Libya all represent rational responses by regional powers to American encroachment on their periphery, yet American policy continues to characterize these actions as unprovoked aggression, requiring forceful response rather than predictable reactions to our own strategic choices that should prompt reconsideration of whether global hegemony serves American interests. The Western Hemisphere remains the foundation upon which all other American commitments rest, because if the United States cannot secure its own neighborhood, then it cannot project power globally without risking vulnerabilities at home that rivals will exploit. The defense of American territory begins not in Kiev or Taipei, but in the Caribbean and Central America, where Russian and Chinese influence threaten to establish the kind of hostile presence that the Monroe Doctrine was designed to prevent. This is not empire, but rather the prerequisite for survival in a competitive international system where only the vigilant endure.